Hello, my name is Jorge Penado, and I am submitting my Ben talk for the 2018-19 BFS class. The most intriguing piece of research that I've done while at Penn would have to be my senior thesis for the International Relations major. In this thesis, I pursued the topic of refugee policymaking in developing countries, particularly the Middle East and North Africa region, as a response to the Syrian refugee crisis. The question that I am pursuing is that of what explains the variation in the regional response of MENA countries with regards to the Syrian refugee crisis, and what role do previous historical experiences play in shaping the current response to Syrian refugees. And so I'm interested in this topic because, one, I spent my semester abroad in Egypt and saw a lot of the impact of Syrian communities in the country, and was really interested in seeing why the Egyptian response is very different from other countries, from, say, a country like Lebanon, which has, after a quick glance in the news, has adopted a much more restrictive policy towards refugees. And so I was really interested in comparing these countries and why they've adopted such different policy. And so the four countries that I am focusing on for this thesis are Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. Three of the four countries are neighboring Syria, and one is not, but still has the fifth highest population of Syrians. And I excluded Iraq because of the political instability in the region, in the country, and how that might alter the response to refugees inflows. And so for this thesis, I first needed to conduct a literature review. And in this literature review, I read an extensive amount of sources of literature, covering from conceptual literature, which was much more concerned with defining the term refugee, to much more observational literature, which placed an emphasis on refugee policymaking in developing countries and the prominence of refugee centrism, meaning that refugee policy and the field is understandably very concerned with refugees themselves, but sometimes at the negligence of the host communities they are being taken into. And so I was really interested in this part of the field, and my thesis therefore pursued an historical analysis in order to understand any historical precedents that have been established in these countries with regards to refugees, particularly to populations such as Palestinians or Iraqis, and how that can directly affect the modern response to Syrians. And the next component of my research design for this thesis was a comparative case study analysis of the four cases that I presented previously. And in this analysis, my independent variable would be national factors, which I read throughout the literature included factors such as domestic absorption capability, security threats, civil and refugee bureaucracy, and international relations. And all of this in perspective with my dependent variable, which was the actual national refugee policy that was determined. And in addition to this, a method that I use in order to understand the causal mechanisms of how certain policy is determined, I used an explaining outcome process tracing method, which saw me directly follow the process of how certain policy is made in these countries. And so what I did is I collected over 168 sources of policy across these four countries, and I analyzed and I categorized them into the my different independent variables in order to see which one, any significant trends in this categorization. And luckily, after I collected the data, I realized that there were significant cases and significant points of information. And so the next steps in my thesis was that the in detailed historical analysis sections for each of the four countries, where I discovered various factors as to why the Egyptian government may have a certain relation with Palestinian refugees, or why the Turkish government may be slightly exclusionary of certain refugees who do not have Turkish ancestry. And so I covered the history of each of these countries with regards to refugees, and I found that extremely interesting. And so after all of this, after the categorization of the policy that I collected, I was able to determine what factors these countries are acting on mostly. And that was really interesting because that's where I saw most of the differences between the countries. And so for my first country, Egypt, I saw that they're acting much more on domestic absorption capability and security threats, meaning that they were very concerned about the limited resources that their country has, while at the same time being highly aware of the fact that many migrants and refugees use Egypt as a launching point to Europe, and how that creates a sort of chaos in the country, and having that is a significant security threat for them. And so that has become a central focus of their policy. In Jordan, I realized that they're mostly acting on domestic absorption capability as well and international relations. They are similarly concerned about the resources that they have and the lack of resources they have to address refugees, but they're also concerned with the international aid that would be coming to them in assistance of these refugees. And that is important to consider when Jordan is determining certain policy on refugees. The next country that I covered, Lebanon, interestingly enough, had three variables that I thought equally define their policy, and that is that of domestic absorption capability as well. They're very much concerned, in such a small country, they're very much concerned with the lack of resources. They're also concerned with international relations, meaning that they have a tense relationship with certain international actors, aka donors, and the UNHCR. And so that relationship is important to determining how Lebanon will act with regards to refugees in the country. And then finally, security threat is important in Lebanon just as much, because it is such a small country. It is important to consider that any significant inflow of people could drastically alter the confessional system already existing in Lebanon, and that was really important in my analysis of the country. And then finally, with Turkey, I realized that they're most acting on differently from other countries, a civilian refugee bureaucracy, meaning that they are very concerned with giving Syrians legal status or formalized status in the country. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're giving them refugee status, but it does mean that they're giving them some protection because of the generally liberal policies that Turkey has adopted. And these policies can be also seen as a result of Turkey's alignment with the EU, the European Union, and since they pursued a bid to enter the EU early in the early 2000s, and the bridge connecting Asia and Europe exists in Turkey, and therefore many refugees take that path into Europe, and so understanding that Europe is very concerned with the refugee crisis on their borders, that they cooperate very much with Turkey in that process, and all of that was really interesting. And so when considering everything, any conclusions that I determined, I realized that all countries are slightly limiting of refugees in their countries. No country has directly addressed or given the legal status to Syrians as refugees because they're afraid of certain factors of how integration would go, or the lack of resources that they have in their country. So that's important to consider when looking at the policy of these countries. All countries accept the presence of international organizations, but some have much more tense relations with others because of much more tense relationships in their country, such as Lebanon, which the confessional system plays a significant part in how Syrians are treated in the country. And so after all of this, I was able to determine that policy in these countries is, and the factors that I presented previously, is generally categorized into three tiers. The first tier, which is the most basic reactive response to refugees in these countries, includes kind of a domestic absorption capability and historical memory, which is dependent on the country's makeup at the time of the Syrians entering the country. The second tier is much more concerned with the makeup of the actual response to the refugee crisis itself, in particular, whether refugees are considered a security threat and whether the international community is willing to help these countries supplement some in some places where they lack. And the third tier, which I determined, was with civilian refugee bureaucracy, meaning that the last thing that a country determines with regards to refugees and their policy is that of the legal status. And that makes sense because a lot of countries are much more interested in first addressing basic needs of refugees. And if they can't meet those, then they can be stalled in the process. And this is important in considering how these countries develop their policy. And so overall, I would say that I've spent almost a year working on this thesis. And after the collection of all of these policies, I definitely feel like I understand a bit more of why these countries are acting the way they are with regards to Syrian refugees in their countries. And I found my thesis extremely informative and an intriguing piece of research while at Penn. Thank you.